I didn't see any evidence of curriculum being taught or their IEP goals being managed and focused on.
A shocking and heartbreaking report from ProPublica highlights the extreme mistreatment of students in a set of private schools in the state of Washington.
Hired as an educational assistant, which to my understanding was a one-on-one assistant, kind of assisting a student one-on-one, and then also a teacher. And about 4 months into my working there, the teacher in the classroom that I was assisting informed me that he was leaving. They never found a new teacher. If there was ever a situation that I felt like I needed some extra assistance for, and I would ask for it, sometimes I would be like mocked almost for asking for the assistance, like, oh, you're calling again, type thing, instead of getting support.
You know, obviously I'm the one that would advocate for my students, so I would ask about the food and why is their lunches what's left over from Fairfax Hospital? And they can only get one of everything, you know, one burnt microwavable pizza and a milk and a bag of carrots. When, you know, this is a growing 13-year-old boy, you know.
The school itself, I think, is set up to be therapeutic, but it's kind of more of like a glorified daycare. It makes it feel like a jail almost, or it makes it feel like a punishment that they are there, and it shouldn't be that way.
So those clips were from people who worked at a set of private schools in the state of Washington that were specifically aimed at providing education for special education students in the state of Washington. And the article in ProPublica goes into great detail about the extreme amount of mistreatment that students had to deal with in these schools, extending to even one incident where a teacher was alleged to have choked a student and another was alleged to have kicked a student, and where many students were kept in isolation for extended periods of time. This was an extreme amount of shocking mistreatment to students that for a very long time went unreported and unrecognized by the state government. But to be clear, this is something that happened under a private institution. And so with this, I want to touch on two main components. The first main component is the problem of privatization and why this represents such a significant issue, especially when it comes to education and the public versus private school debate. First and foremost is the issue of profit incentive, because in reality, when you have private schools, the entire incentive becomes completely different, especially when you have private schools that are funded by public dollars. All of a sudden, instead of focusing on education or accountability of the public, the private schools' main focus is to take in as much government money as humanly possible while spending the absolute bare minimum amount of money on students. And because the private institution was the one that was responsible for keeping track of the students, of making sure that they were progressing and making sure of their health and safety, there's a degree of separation that allows uncertainty and prevents real transparency by creating that layer of separation between the private schools and the public officials that are supposed to oversee the education system. And that is exactly what these private schools exploited in order to get around actually following their responsibility to report these different complaints and issues to the state government in general, which is a major issue with privatization, because whenever you take something that is supposed to be the role of the state and you hand it to a private company, that private company is going to have direct control over everything that is happening on the ground, and thus will actually have the ability to maliciously warp the data that's coming from it, and will be able to obfuscate any type of information that would come from the institution that normally would be directly under the supervision of the state. And these things combined led to extreme staffing shortages, such that students simply did not have enough teachers around them to give them the care or the attention that they needed. This reality is no doubt part of what created such a toxic environment for these students, which ended up with some of these students being held in isolation and some of them allegedly being hit and choked by staff. Because once again, the main purpose of private education is to take in money. It is not actually to educate or care for students. And they were doing this while getting funding from the state government. And I think this shows exactly why privatization simply doesn't make any sense. All it does is take the same government dollars and it funnels it through a system that is less transparent and that is less focused on the well-being of students. And the other layer that I think is really critical in this is the way that the United States, by and large, large treat special education students. Because at the end of the day, the United States has never fully abandoned the idea of eugenics. Unfortunately, we still have this idea that there are smart students and there are bad students, and that the bad students might be holding back the smart students. A lot of this is really rooted in the belief in the existence of talent. And you probably have propagated this without even realizing that's what you're doing. If you've said things about yourself like, oh, I'm just bad at math, or if you have heard people say, oh, I'm just bad at math, or, Billy's just not so great at this thing, or Sally's just not so great at this other thing, then you have bought into these narratives. And one of the reasons you've probably bought into some of these narratives is because you were taught them in schools. Because very much throughout our public education system, and throughout the education system in general, we tend to push this idea of certain students having talent and being innately better at certain things than other students, and using that as an explanatory factor as to why some students are doing better than others. When the reality is that is fundamentally not true. The truth of the matter is that education is a combination of a positive environment and hard work on the part of the student and the teachers. Because fundamentally, anybody can learn, and you have to recognize that anybody can learn. Even you can learn, except you have to first believe that you can learn in order to learn, because that is a central part of creating a welcoming educational environment where people feel like they can achieve things through their efforts. And while it might take some people a little bit more work than others to get to certain points on certain subjects, the reality is believing that some people are just magically talented actually prevents people from putting in the work that is necessary to truly learn things. So we are actively limiting ourselves, and especially our students, by pushing this idea of some people being inherently more talented than others. And very often, talent is the result of children being exposed to different ideas or environments earlier on in life that simply didn't get detected or measured or written down anywhere. Which really brings us to the core conclusions of what we can learn from this horrific situation that happened in Washington. First and foremost, we need to recognize that private institutions are never going to provide a decent education. They are only going to educate people to the bare minimum that is necessary. And even then, they will often fall behind that because there is not that public accountability. But the other thing we need to learn is the reality that separating special education students away from everybody else doesn't actually work, and it doesn't make any sense. And going one step further, tracking students between the advanced tracks and the regular track actually harms both sets of students, and it hinders their ability to learn for a litany of different reasons, but mainly because it pushes this idea of talent and creates many opportunities to recreate classist and racist structures that exist within the United States by amplifying the assumptions that teachers have about their students, as well as reinforcing historical inequalities. The truth of the matter is that when students with different mindsets and different amounts of knowledge in different subjects are all working together, what you actually get is them bouncing off ideas from each other, them learning from each other, and creating a more healthy environment where everybody is more willing to cooperate, collaborate, and learn together, while also emphasizing the notion that anybody can learn, which once again is a necessary step for learning at all. And then the last bit is emphasizing teachers over all the different bells and whistles. Fundamentally, if you look at the best education systems in the world, you recognize that teachers are the top priority, making sure that you have teachers that are well paid and that you have plenty of them, and then giving those teachers the freedom to react to whatever their students need is what creates the best environment for students to be able to learn. Students need to be able to explore subjects, and they actually need to play a role in leading the direction of where the learning is going. And the teachers need to be able to facilitate the different directions that students might need to go in. And teachers also need to facilitate spending more time working on one subject or another. And this needs to be flexible, which means that instead of hyper focusing on incredibly standardized curriculum or spending tons of money on tech budgets for like high tech computer labs and things like that, we really need to prioritize the teachers above and beyond everything else, because they are at the end of the day the people that are teaching the students, and they are the ones who are going to be able to give time to the students to help them learn. So fundamentally, the key takeaways from this is that privatization fundamentally does not work and is extremely harmful for students. And the other takeaway is that we really need to trust school teachers to do their best. And that also means that we need to have enough school teachers so that they're not overwhelmed, so that they actually can do their best.